I believe I'm an employee of the YWCA, but I'm here today as myself because the YWCA has already sent our opposition to this directly to the mayor's office. But I wanted to register that I'm opposed to this as it unnecessarily criminalizes our homeless neighbors. There's been direction from the Department of Justice that came down just last week on this matter that specifically designates policies exactly like this as absurd and not helpful. It's pretty well established that there is a good deal of need in our community to address homeless issues, and this is not a policy that will in any way support our neighbors that find themselves without shelter.
Hi, my name is Tammy Miller. I run a group called the all-volunteer group of citizens called the Friends of the State Street Family, and I'm here to obviously oppose this ordinance. I feel like the mayor has really been targeting homeless individuals in a lot of his policies lately, and it's unfortunate because with 0-2016, this type of press and this type of attack is not helpful in moving those goals forward. And before you start taking things away, you have to give people an opportunity to go someplace. The people in front of the city county building, for instance, and I know that it's been a sticking point for a lot of city and county officials. But what you have to realize, and I do outreach throughout the entire city of Madison. I climb up under bridges. I go and find people living in their cars. And there just isn't enough shelter for women and children. There are elderly people outside, there are disabled people outside, there are veterans outside. So those are the people we're talking about, not just maybe the super visible people in front of the city county building. Maybe you've lost any empathy that you may have had for them, but we're talking about a larger group of people here that have no alternative. I get calls from people all the time, women with little children who get turned away from the Salvation Army every other day. There's only shelter for them every other day. Where are they supposed to go? They're not even allowed to sleep outside now. I feel like the government should be judged by how we treat our most vulnerable people. And if we do this to our most vulnerable people, shame on us.
All right, so does anyone have any disclosures or recusals?
Well, Bill, I did mention this particular ordinance in an article I wrote. My organization has not taken a stand. I'm not sure, and I'm a citizen under this. I mean, I don't.
Yeah.
Of course, maybe just the fact that I'm saying this is good.
That's
okay.
A disclosure, and that's fine.
Okay. Okay.
Is everyone aware of the article she's referencing?
Oh, okay. that was in the paper on Tuesday.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay.
Just wanted to make sure so that there wasn't anyone.
Okay.
Open that.
About a month ago, a little more than a month ago, I made a phone call to the National Coalition for the Homeless to discuss the exponentially growing problem that we've had over the last few years. And let's be very clear about this. What we are talking about is because of Madison's compassion and concern and openness, there are more and more people arriving here every week, if not every day, who do not have homes. Some of these people include parents and children who are looking for a home and looking to start a life in this community. Some of them are like the man I spoke with on Saturday night who came here from Janesville. Some of them are individuals who have heard how easy it is to get support in Madison in regards to food, in regards to bedding, in regards to a bicycle, access to transportation, and housing, permanent housing and jobs is not on their list. They are draining millions and millions of dollars of resources from this community so that we cannot attend to the folks who are being turned away at the Salvation Army, who don't have access. When I made that call, I was told that there are two approaches to homelessness in this country. What was referred to as a West Coast approach, which I might say when you hear it, we are subscribing to, and the other is a Boston approach. The West Coast approach is compassion, it's fervent protection of the constitutional rights of homeless people, and there are no rules. There's no sense of responsibility, either in regards to the homeless or in some instances those who are assisting homeless within the community. Portland, Seattle, and San Francisco are examples. And it's interesting to note that Portland recently adopted some new ordinances, which seem to be ineffective, as has San Francisco. Boston, on the other hand, has a very different approach. Boston is just as compassionate and just as protective of the rights, but is firm in regards to behavior. And that firmness doesn't attract the kinds of people who arrived here in the last month. An individual who attempted to rape a woman on the south bicycle path near campus. An individual who this last week assaulted a 74-year-old man in the Willie Street neighborhood. An individual who 2 nights ago got into a knife fight on the steps of the city county building, which spilled over to the municipal building. An individual who took it upon himself to assist either his wife or his partner in her efforts to hide her drug paraphernalia and interfere with the police arrest. And I can go on and on of recent incidents just in the last month involving recently arrived people who are taking advantage of the generosity and compassion of people in this city. There are 242,000 Madisonians. There are countless more visitors every day. 10 and 12-year-old children who play in grassy areas downtown should not have to be protected from hypodermic needles. There are 80 people who are probably at the heart of this problem. And these ordinances are an effort to get conformity in behavior. I see someone shaking their head. I want to explain something about the psychology of group behavior, particularly people who have substance abuse and mental illness challenges. And this is something else that the gentleman I spoke to from the National Coalition said to me. Do not allow larger congregations more than 3 or 4 people. If you have 50 people in one group, as opposed to that group broken up into collections of 3 and 4 people, the 50 people are going to proportionately have far more incidents of attacks, assaults, and the various kinds of behaviors we're talking about. Now, I have the responsibility to 240,000 residents and the visitors. Every time you whine about a home for the gentleman from Colorado who came here and within 4 weeks attempted to rape a young woman in this community, I have to worry about every potential victim of a rape. Every time you worry about someone who arrives here 3 weeks ago to get the benefits of our generosity, I have to worry about that individual defecating where people eat. And then there's the glorious incident that occurred this week, where one of our most prominent residents of the front steps of the City County building took it upon herself to wash her underwear in the drinking fountain of the first floor. Now already, most of the city employees from the ground floor, the first floor, and the second floor do not use any of those restrooms. They are now being given more time for restroom breaks so they can go to the third and fourth floors. Why? Because of the evidence that was presented to the City County Liaison Committee last week of people using those restrooms and basically defecating without regard to the location of the toilet. The problems at State and Carroll are just as grievous. The fighting and the assaults that go on late into the evening and early morning are indescribable. For 4 years, over 4 years, I've been asking for help. I have repeatedly gone to the county and shared with others who are providers to the homeless community about the need for those responsible for mental health and substance abuse to take greater action in this regard. We just recently convened a staff group of city employees to address 5 individuals in this community. Mary, Sue, the 2 gentlemen who can barely get around in their wheelchairs, as well as 1 individual absent of a walker who was last seen leaving Wilson Street with a discarded office chair with wheels and working his way down the bike path, using it as a walker. The city of Madison is not responsible for social services, mental health, and substance abuse. But because no one else around here can deal with it, we are attempting to figure out an intervention, and maybe to persuade the county in those instances where people cannot take care of themselves to use its power, as expensive as it is, but not nearly as expensive as the minimal $30 million alone that comes from our police and fire department to deal with people with mental illness and substance abuse problems. Those are not just the homeless. Those are all people. That ranges from the continual conveyances of people to detox, to the hospitals, as well as people who come home drunk and attempt to prepare a dinner and then set their chair and their hair on fire. That's what's happening out there. There was a time when we made requests of organizations. If you're providing housing services, make sure you have a partner who is doing employment counseling and training. If you're doing food service, make sure you're partnering with somebody who provides transportation services. We are writing checks for millions of dollars a year, either for direct city services in these areas or to buy them, purchase them from nonprofits. That doesn't include the tens of millions of dollars I just described that police and fire alone are called upon to provide these services. We had 8 police officers just 2 weeks ago in Winnebago, because you have to have 2 officers to transport somebody with a mental illness challenge because they're no longer accepted. So you want to talk about children in need of housing, in need of food. You want to talk about parents who want to be part of a supportive family. They are commanding far fewer resources than are the 80 people and the collection of people who have housing that are causing this chaos and this expense. And I haven't even gotten into the area of what it's doing to your businesses. Your neighbors. There's 2 more things thoughts I want to leave you with. One, there seems to be an air of superiority on the part of some folks saying, I can live with this. You privileged people can't, and therefore I'm a better person than you. The people who are concerned about this are not inferior. They've made rational analysis. They've looked at how we are wasting the money that could go to other sources to create a better community. Secondly, we've made an enormous commitment over the next 5 years, $5 million a year, for Housing First, for permanent housing. Rethke is already under construction, and it is designed and built for the toughest and most challenging individuals in regards to the chronically homeless. Now, some people say, well, Mayor, you know that the premise of Housing First is that you provide the housing and then you provide all those supportive services which become much more effective once people have housing, and that is true. But the corollary to that is not to do nothing in terms of everything from substance abuse and mental illness to violence and threats to human life. I don't know how many people have died on the streets in this city in the last 4 or 5 years. I do know of 3 specific cases. And all 3 of them are the result of allowing individuals to live on the streets without protection. One was the unfortunate man who was killed mistakenly by another homeless individual who got the wrong guy. The second example is an individual who was intoxicated, went into Lake Mendota and drowned. And the third was an individual who, in the middle of that incredible heat wave we had 3 years ago, continued to drink all night, having been warned and counseled, and by 5 a.m. was dead from dehydration. I repeat, there's 242,000 people in this city. I don't want a child infected stumbling over a needle. I don't want a repetition of this week's knife fight to end in a death. Something has to be done. Up until now, every effort to change behaviors has resulted in accusations that there's a lack of compassion, a lack of concern, and there's not enough empathy for the folks we must care about the most. If we cared about them the most, just as we want them to have permanent housing, we want everyone to live a life in safety where they're not looking over their shoulder for the next danger. Now, I've been asked, are parts of this more important than others? And I'll simply say that the part about sleeping on a bench, the part that covers the sleeping on benches, is probably the least important. But I want to point out, as we talk about constitutional issues, and remind people specifically about the latest position, that you cannot fine people or make it an ordinance violation for sleeping in public places was only determined if there is no room at the inn. So as long as there is availability at Porchlight for those men, that is not what the court said. That's not the position of the Justice Department. I have to go somewhere else this evening. I'll be glad to stay for a short time to answer questions.
Unfinished.
Gloria, are you going to be here a while?
I'll be here for a little bit.
Okay. And Gloria has worked with us on this, obviously, being part of the mayoral staff, and she can also assist in the discussion.
I've got everybody's hands who shot up. Anyone besides this quadrant of the table? All right, Corinda.
I actually have several things that I actually want to say. One, the first thing is when you talked about not grouping people more than 3 to a group, that reminds me of what they used to say about African Americans hanging in a group. And to me, did not just sit right with me.
Well, that's what comes from the experts on homelessness.
Well, that's what the experts said years ago about black people being in a group also. And then the other thing I wanted to say is, if you're wanting to target behaviors, I don't think you should be grouping all people in a group who are homeless, but do what law enforcement do. They target behaviors. And which is kind of what you talked about with community policing, which is why they're in certain communities of color, was because you were targeting behaviors and trying to get those behaviors. So to group, that would be like grouping all African Americans in a group to say that, you know, all homeless people are this way, and because some are acting out, the rest of them should be penalized for that. I don't agree with that. And then when you look at trauma, the research and the experts also tell us that trauma is a result of people living in poverty, people living homeless, people, and those things are triggers for mental health issues. And when you say that we are not, the city is not responsible for those people with mental health issues, the city is responsible for every citizen that lives in this community. And so you cannot separate certain people out that we're not responsible for them, because we are.
We are not responsible for national defense. We are not responsible for federal agriculture policy. And we are not responsible for mental health treatment and substance abuse. That is, by law, the responsibility of the state and of the county. That is the exact reason why we've gone to the county and asked them to do involuntary commitments in extreme cases where we believe that an individual is in danger to themselves and to other people.
Not to interrupt, I know I've got you guys next, I just want to ask a quick question about that. What specifically has been the county's response to this? Are they simply just not doing anything?
Every single meeting that we have had with them that I personally attended, I've been told about the difficulty and the challenges and the fact that after a commitment is made for 90 days, you have to do it again. I also want to point out that if you compare the availability of county mental health services today to what was available 20 and 30 and 40 years ago, it is significantly reduced.
Right.
You add to that the fact that we now have seen reductions of availability of the detox center, which occurred 2 years ago, and then the state closing the local mental health facility. As I said, our police officers now have to go a much further distance for a much longer period of time, taking them out of service, meaning we're short-staffed, or we have to add on additional officers, are all evidence of the county and the state having responsibility. And I don't understand why everybody's always beating up on the city and not focusing on the work that needs to be done by others.
Thank you for that. We'll beat up more on the county and the state too.
Yeah.
I just want a clarification on what you, on the, as long as there's availability in a shelter, can you repeat that and then explain a bit more with that?
The latest decision and rulings that have brought interest lately is a statement that you can't arrest someone for sleeping in a public place. That's basically the essence of it. Though there's some things that are clearly distinct, such as sleeping in the middle of the sidewalk or sleeping in an area that is a fire lane. Challenges that we have and which are enforceable under the ordinances. But what the court is completely saying is you can't arrest somebody for that if there is no available shelter space for them. And the point is, tonight, if you go to Porchlight, there are going to be dozens and dozens of empty beds. I can't tell you about the situation in other facilities, but that's the case. And that's, by the way, one of the reasons we want people there, because there is supervision. And of course, then there's the counter answer that people don't want to go there. And then there's all sorts of reasons people don't want to go there. Some people don't want to go there because they don't feel safe there. Other people don't want to go there because you can't shoot up, you can't be drunk.
Oh my God. So the 60 days that they can stay there in 1 year.
I'm sorry, public comment.
He knows the truth.
That's just, I want to remind folks that can't take comments from out there. There are a couple of folks who spoke. There are a couple of people who are here who are central to some of these issues that I recognize that I will probably be asking questions of later. But while we still have the mayor here, let's try to direct our questions there. Kira, did you have anything else?
That's all I wanted to
Okay,
say.
Zach.
I had two questions. One is, you kind of incited some of these kind of what I would call horror stories that have happened. One that's relatively near where I live. And then the deaths of some of the homeless people that we've seen in the city. Can you, I'm having a hard time understanding, can you describe how these time limits in this ordinance would prevent or address those issues?
It's going to allow the police department to separate people out, get us smaller groups, and get control, which is what is so tough right now on both the steps of the city-county building and in regards to State and Carroll. For example, there are dozens and dozens of other places within the city where there are small groups of homeless people living. And we're not focused on that. Why? Because they have not created these kinds of problems. And I'm sorry you mischaracterized it in my judgment as horror stories. A woman being sexually assaulted and almost raped is more than a horror story. It is a vicious crime. A man being stabbed and not dying, but being stabbed and could have died is not a horror story. It's real. A 74-year-old man being attacked on Willie Street by a 24-year-old and then attacking a 40-year-old who tries to intervene is not just a horror story. It's a real problem, and I'm responsible for it. And so is most of the city's staff. And we've got to have the tools to do it. We've got to break up these groups. We cannot allow them to continue to conduct and give each other the support to shooting up heroin, to accosting people who are walking up and down the street. That's what this is about. And if 80 people are more important than the victims, the potential victims, and so many other homeless who are also the victims, then I think we're misguided and we've mistakenly adopted that West Coast approach and not the Boston approach.
That's the second time you brought up Boston. I also want to mention one of the things I was making sure that I saw when I was just in Boston a few weeks ago. They have a very large shelter right in the heart of their financial district. So, I mean, that's one of the things that advocates have been talking about, and I just wanted to make mention. They have services throughout their city, throughout the area, and not saying we don't, but they have a very large city-run shelter right in the heart of downtown.
Well, Metropolitan Boston's about, what? Over 10 times the size of that.
Yep. All right.
Can I follow up on
Sure,
that question? This ordinance, are you saying then that in order to break up these groups and to address the issues that, I don't know if I'm missing something, but I think could already be addressed through ordinances that are already on the book or laws that already can be enforced, is time limits in this ordinance required to, is it the only way that you can address those other issues that are, in my opinion, already kind of on the book?
It's one of many ways we can address it, but we feel that it's needed. I mean, I just visually saw it today. A place where somebody had been sleeping repeatedly this week, and it is a place where delivery trucks and emergency vehicles go. Now, they weren't at that spot. This is not an area that's a normal place to drive. It is the space on North Francis between State and Langdon Street. But we've had numerous people sleeping there in this past summer. Now, what's going to happen at 4 a.m. if an emergency vehicle turns into that space and doesn't see the individual?
I got a question on the bail deposit and the fine. I'm a little concerned on what does that do in terms of a deterrent.
It's not about that. It's ability to use the arrest to move the person. Okay. I couldn't care less about the size of the fine for the forfeiture. And as we've discussed in other meetings, if somebody's got outstanding fines and forfeitures for these kinds of events, the moment that they agree to go into permanent housing, we will go to the courts and ask that everything be discharged.
That's not it. That's the part I want to hear about. Because that's the frightening part for a lot of
It's not enough affordable housing either.
If that is indeed going to be the case, is that going to be written into the ordinance?
I imagine we could write it in.
I would like to see that.
I mean, does anyone else have any questions before I start with a couple? And how much time do you have to do it? Do we still have before?
The plan was to leave at 5:45, but that's still a minute away.
I think we can lightning around these. One of the questions I have on this is that, to sort of back up on Chuck's point here, is that, is there any thought to lowering these fines and adding a caveat like we said?
I'd want to hear from the city attorney. I believe those were simply, those specific amounts were put in and to make the fines comparable to similar offenses in other categories.
Okay.
But like I said, the amount of the fine and its existence is not an issue.
Okay. And I assume that you're aware that fines like these, when these pile up and people start having to go to court and get in prison for it.
I'm well aware of all of that, and that is why, not only in this instance, if someone goes into permanent housing, would we be more than happy to discharge all of the fines and forfeitures, but also, that's why separately, we are supportive of other programs in the city to assist people in things like driver's license recovery and other activities where fines and forfeitures are oftentimes an impediment to everything from getting driver's license to getting housing.
Okay. And then, and we are aware, I assume, that these fines, the way that this would be policed, the way this would be enforced, is going to be disproportionately affecting black and brown people.
I'm not sure about that. I'm really not.
That's all I got.
The majority of people on the steps of the city county building are white. The folks who are at State and Carroll and Mifflin, majority are African American. But one of the points about that site is that it's very uncertain as to how many of them are actually homeless.
Okay. So I've got, does anybody else have any questions before we let the mayor?
I don't have a question, but I just have a statement. I think it seems like when you say the tickets will be dropped as soon as they get in permanent housing, that is that simple. It's not that simple. There are not enough affordable housing for people to get in. And we already know from, I'm on a task force for alternatives to incarceration, that a lot of these incentives are used at other people's discrepancy, which doesn't seem to fare equally across the board. So I am concerned that there will be more disparities in terms of people of color, not just having access to services, getting into housing and getting those alternatives. And you suggested that, oh, these fines will go away. It's funny because when the young gifted and blacks and those students were getting arrested for laying in the streets and refusing to move, that was my suggestion to the chief, to remove them. Once he removed them to Goodman Center, why did they have to get those tickets? Why didn't they just do away with the tickets? And I got a different response than what you're here saying right now. So if it can be an alternative, then it could have been an alternative for those black students that were arrested in the streets. And so when we start to see, here it is, and you said the majority of the people in the city county building are not people of color, then once again, we're seeing these discrepancies across the board in terms of how people who look different and act different are being treated.
Well, it seems to me that, and I've spent a lot of time discussing this over 50 years, that when you make a statement of civil disobedience, and I've done this and suffered the consequences more than once, part of it, and part of the statement, is to accept the consequence of the deliberate violation of the law. I don't think that the act of civil disobedience is to be compared to what we're talking about here, which is unsafe behavior, which is not part of an act of civil disobedience. But every time I was arrested, I took the consequences, as were the other people who I was arrested with.
But the consequences didn't affect you the same way that they do people of color. As a non-person of color, they don't affect you the same.
When I got beat, it hurt just as much.
So.
Do you have any other comments, questions for the mayor?
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Anybody need a recess? Couple minutes?